Thank you, Tanveer, for inviting me here to pay my tributes to Professor T.K. Oommen. In the passing of Professor T.K. Oommen, Indian sociology has lost one of its leading stalwarts, and the Center for the Study of Social Systems has really lost a very valuable member of the faculty. Despite the fact that Professor Oommen had retired many years ago, he was still very much part and parcel of the Center for the Study of Social Systems as emeritus professor. Unlike many of my colleagues who are here today, of course, Maitrayee has spoken about the fear that she felt of Professor Oommen, but nonetheless, I think she was very fortunate to have been in an institution where Professor Oommen was a teacher, even though she may not have been taught by him directly. So I was not so fortunate. I met Professor Oommen only in the year 1986, after I joined the faculty of the Center at the Study of Social Systems as an assistant professor. And by the time I joined the CSSS as assistant professor, Professor Oommen had attained a stature of very high eminence, so which was rather intimidating for a person like me, who comes from geographically and cultural periphery. You can imagine the kind of fear that I had of interacting with him directly. So I kept away from him for quite a while. But then the 16 years of service that I've had the opportunity to work together and teach together with Professor Oommen in the Center for the Study of Social Systems, I discovered a very different facet of his personality. I would like to say that I had also experienced a few crises during that period in terms of health and other tragedies in the family. And of all my colleagues in the Center for the Social Systems, Professor Oommen was the sole colleague who made it a point to visit me at my house twice to ask me if I needed help. So that was the personality and the personal quality of a person of the stature of Professor Oommen, notwithstanding his intellectual prowess and scholastic achievements. But I also realized it's just not his personal quality as such, but also a very clear reflection of his professional orientation, which lays great stress on inclusivity, as well as also a direct engagement with the people with whom you work with or study with together. So that was Professor Oommen, the charisma of the man. And this belied the initial image that I had of Professor Oommen as someone that is, proud or authoritarian, but a very different person altogether. And I got to know Professor Oommen much closer, in fact, after he retired from the Center for the Social Systems, when I was looking after the Center for the Northeast Studies program, where Professor Oommen at that time had joined as the Professor Emeritus, and he would come to the center, and I needed advice. So he was always very willing to give advice on anything that you seek, and also very friendly, always asking you, what are you up to? What are you working on? So that's the kind of person that he was. And it would be no saturating to say that Professor Oommen had really revolutionized sociology in India. For those of us who work on marginalized communities, his writings provided valuable insights, both on the theoretical and methodological plane. A staunch supporter of diversity and pluralism. Many earlier speakers have emphasized that fact. So what I found with Professor Oommen was that his respect for diversity and pluralism also made him to be critical, of the kind of methodology that tended to be followed by scholars in the sociology department across the country, which tended to give more privilege to the top-down approach, which gave more privilege and importance to the perspectives of the dominant groups, to the perspective of state institutions, rather than looking at things from below. Such a perspective, ended up obscuring the processes and structures, of those who lie at the bottom of the ladder. So Professor Oommen was critical of this, and he made it a point to ensure that sociologists, in order to have a holistic understanding of the Indian social reality, they need not only to rely on the Western model and paradigms in their analysis, in their framework, but also try to develop indigenous ideas from the bottom, which will help them make better sense of social reality. And also he emphasizes the point that we need to look at the society from the perspective, of the people on the ground, because that kind of perspective will give you a better understanding of the realities of Indian society. So the perspective from below helps to unravel the systems of inequality, the exclusions, and the marginalization of those who are not really in the dominant groups. So that was Professor Oommen in his studies. So for scholars like me, who work on marginalized communities, his perspective was extremely valuable and helped me also to make sense of many of the things that I study. So from the vantage point of Northeast India, a region which has been subjected and borne the major brunt of multiple forms of marginality, whether at the political level, cultural level, economic, or geography. Northeast India has been seen as a marginal society, a society that is peripheral to the larger Indian entity, that is India. It is an entity, it is a part of the country, a society which do not have very much in common with the majority of mainland Indian society. So Professor Oommen's concepts that he had developed in his study, concepts of democratization of knowledge, giving equal importance to different systems of knowledge, not only textual knowledge, but also the knowledge which emanate from the ground. His ideas of inclusiveness, or inclusivity, his ideas of civic equality, these really help many of us who work on the Northeast to make sense of the problem, the complex problem, which otherwise remained invisible and really not very meaningful. But the concepts and the categories that he had crafted enabled scholars like me and many others to make use of those and apply them to the reality which we study, to see the relationship and the pattern which emerge on the ground. So what this meant that Northeast India, which initially had been a kind of an academic hinterland, more recently we see that Northeast India has been transformed into a vibrant site where theories are formulated and tested. That's, I think, we owe a lot to a person like Professor Aditya Oommen, really, who brought about this kind of methodological shift in the discipline of sociology. And his perspective from below, the categories and concepts that he had developed are not used by sociologists alone. In fact, I did not see much of a sociologist in Northeast India making use of these categories, but scholars from other disciplines, those particularly who used the post-colonial framework, when I look at the writings, I see a very strong echo of the ideas that Professor Oommen really had developed. Now, on the institutional plane, I would say that Professor Oommen also is an avid institutional builder, and we see this very clearly in the happenings that take place in the center of the Zali social system in the few years that I had the privilege in being together with him. Now, one of the things that had happened when I was at that time a relatively young teacher in the department was at a time when we had to discuss the admissions of the students, the intake for the MA admissions. Now, Professor Oommen came up with a very novel idea, which really amazed me, that students from the reserve category who secured the same marks as those, at par with students from the general category, those students should be released from the reserve category and push upwards to the general category. So, because according to Professor Oommen, it makes more meaning to release these students from the slot and enable them to go up, which will help to improve social mobility. And this is beneficial not only for those students in the reserve category, but also for those in general category, because it opens up it widens the circle of access to education. Education is a passport to success, and education is a very important tool of social empowerment, political empowerment, empowerment of various kinds. I think Professor Oommen realizes that. So by opening up a slot for the meritorious students, from the reserve category, allow them to move up into the upper category, the general category, and accordingly also increase the number of intakes for students from the general category also to match with the number of students who have been pushed up from the lower category. I think this is beneficial for everyone. So across the spectrum, whether it's general category students or those in the reserve category, they benefit very much from this. So it's really a person of the stature and vision of Professor Dr. Oommen who could see this, and I really found it, very, very good, at least in my own personal perspective. And what I also see this, that this is basically, I think, Professor Dr. Oommen's perspective really in action. His idea of self-equality, is played out in this very in this very policy they adopted with respect for admission to students. So this really goes to his credit, and I do hope that we still have the same policy now, because the admission policy now, it seems, has been centralized by the UGC or other institutions of learning, and I think centers and departments at the university level do not have much say into this. So it really freezes and narrows down the access of students to education. I think that will really be contrary to any kind of a policy that really aspires for empowerment of students across the spectrum. And also what I see in this particular policy adopted by Sir Dr. Oommen was how he tried to balance merit with justice, recognition of individual merit. Those students are meritorious enough to have achieved marks at par with those at a higher level, are given credit for what they have done. And also at the same time, you ensure that so that the general category students do not miss out. So according to the seats would also be given an increase for them. So what I see in this kind of a policy by Professor Oommen was tempering justice with merit. The other little information, perhaps, which many of you may not know, those who are not part of the Center for Institutional Systems, was that Professor Oommen, as an avid institution builder, was very concerned about the performance and the growth of the discipline, across generations. And I think credit goes to him because, as far as I know, he was the only teacher that I know of who had donated 100,000 rupees when he retired in the year 2002 to establish an endowment fund, the interest from which would be utilized to provide, confer a certificate of merit and cash award to the topper from the MA class. I think such kind of action really, goes to show the kind of love that he has for scholarship, the kind of motivation that he really tries to, provide, for the younger students. So I'm very grateful that I had this opportunity to work with Professor Oommen for 16 years, during his teachingship at the Center for Institutional Systems, and also to have interaction with him, after his retirement also. And the last time that I saw Professor Oommen giving a speech in a public forum was at the 47th All India Sociological Conference, which was held in Meghalaya in the year 2022. Professor Oommen was at that time 84 years of age. And the other day when we went to his house after he passed away, and we met his son, and I told him that, that I remember Professor Dr. Oommen's speech, the keynote address which I presented on the foibles of Indian sociology, some suggestions for rectification. He spoke with such passion, and pointing out the institutional and intellectual weaknesses of sociology, and coming up, with suggestions of his own in order to improve the discipline. I think many of you would know that. I don't think I need to go to that. But what really struck me was that only a person who is really full of conviction can speak with that kind of a passion, with that kind of a degree of commitment to it. And of course, knowing fully well that not everybody really would go along with some of the things that he said. But Despite all that, Professor Oommen went ahead and gave a speech and came up with a list of suggestions of how to improve the discipline of sociology, to reach sociology, to the larger section of the society, to produce sociology which is grounded in the theories and concepts that are indigenously developed, that spring from the ground, to come up with theories that are innovative, and also to make sociology more relevant. I mean, many of the speakers have spoken about Professor Oommen's keenness to ensure that we do not confine our research to the universities or to the halls of conferences and seminars, but also ensure that we engage with public issues which are linked to policy and also underlined and informed by ideas of justice. My wish is that, dear Professor, please do rest in peace. And we thank you for the legacy that you have left us, and may it continue to be a source of inspiration and insights for generations of students to come. Thank you.